everybody, this is Hua. Welcome back to my storytelling channel. I'm here today to read to you part 8 of Nkauj Plig. So sit back, relax, and enjoy. The wedding dress cloaked Mai Sia's body perfectly, as her mother stood behind her helping put the final touches to her hair. She had been restless last night, knowing today was going to be her wedding. In a few short hours, Nkauj would be here with a wedding party, and the process would begin. She felt her heart sink low with a wandering feeling of becoming a stranger in a new land. She turned around and took her mother's hands in hers. Nia, talk about sa kulujo. Dia rong ni ko tu she hen. Ongo nya yo chulun si sha. Dia kulu she chi tu leo kunia. Mai Sia said as tears rolled down her cheeks. Jillian reached up and wiped them away, running her hands down her cheeks. Min Zai, sao tu she ma? Ka tu she wa da chi. Mun ba ka lu nei sư ka chi mu lun si. Nkauj tu nye te lu ko hen. Sao ko la? She pulled her daughter into her arms and held her as Pavo entered with a tray of beautiful jewelries. Jillian pulled away and smiled, reaching for the jewelries. La ku ka chap la. The wedding dress was a simple white gown with off-the-shoulder design with a long train and bell sleeves. It had crystallized beads all over the front and back of the gown. As she moved, it sparkled and shined like the moon. Her hair was up in a bun, cascaded with curls, and a few rhinestone combs pushed in between the strands. Droplets of jade earrings hung from her ears. As she made her way down the stairs, she saw that Nkauj had already arrived and was standing in the front hall with his men-at-arms bearing gifts. He wore his signature green cloak behind him, but wore all white in tunic and pants. He looked rather dashing, if Mai Sia had to be honest. Her mother was beside her as she made her way to where her father and Nkauj stood. But when she looked around the room, her sister was nowhere in sight. As soon as she reached her father, he extended a hand to her. Mai Sia, nu no, yo ka lu chung. Ku mo ka cho phi cho mi tu Nkauj. Nu no mu ka yo nu tu. Du ka lu shia kan te. Ha lu ka yo. Te shai ka lu ning ka mong ri. Ku wa ka zi yo chơ ka te Nkauj li ku yo chơ tao. He Sing said. O cha ku zi. He Sing brought Mai Sia to where Nkauj stood and took his hand to place it on top of his daughter's. Nkauj, cứ tuần sai chỉ ở tờ play tờ lọ nó mò. Cứ vật gì như tàu lọ mò của xia. Nếu tư cả lúc xia lúc xia tàu nữa là, cho nên trả tôi được của tôi gì cũng như chỉ xả lại cả. Sự chỉ bố có món được phải tôi ít to, ya chỉ món nâng chỉ món trả. Nkauj smiled and took both of Mai Sia's hand, pulling her to him. Cứ cho lử đâu có tôi gì. Mai Sia's heart began beating fast as her husband stood and watched her with loving eyes. She felt her heart ache for her parents as she turned to look at them once again. Nkauj tilted her chin to look at him, and he leaned toward her, ready to capture her lips in a kiss. As they neared each other, the sound of the arrow hissing through the air cut through and hit Nkauj from behind. But because he was so close to her, it pierced her as well. Sing shouted for his men-at-arms to raise alarm. Mai Sia felt the warm blood cascade down her body and stain her white gown as Nkauj removed the sword and swung, snapping the arrow that bound them together in half. He caught her before she fell and picked her up. Ba zao xie! He cried to his men-at-arms. He rushed up the stairs, holding Mai Sia as she began to bleed. Screams and cries were heard as Jillian and Nkauj both were tucked away into the hiding cellar by Sing as he prepared for battle. Once Nkauj arrived at Mai Sia's chamber, he set her down on the bed and caught her hands in his. Sunshine, ku nhớ nó. Di shaiko kutumingo nya. Haila ludako, he whispered. Mai Sia felt her body begin to shake. Bakua. Another arrow flew in from the opened window, and King Su removed his sword and swung it in half. He gently laid Mai Sia down and watched as Cheng Tu climbed in through the balcony. King Su's eyes opened wide as the man smiled. Min Dovo. Ya baka to shia loa. Che, go your chito min go nyalo, Cheng Su said as he crossed his arms. Go your gate hing lo, ya ka side there good go nya, your dog got jaw young yimoko, King Su said. Cheng Tu laughed. Chỉ mua nu có ya tao nâng rong liao King Su. Cú ya ta có chua cho cái chua rau lên da. Khỏi rong cái có chỉ cho có từ mình go nya có cho xia có nửa trong mò nửa lúc khoảng cái là sao. Tại cú ya ba lu nửa tầm bảo lệ. Mai Sia pushed herself to a sitting position. Go ya linh tia, cú chỉ tao đã chỉ cho có. Laughing, he replied, Sa shi shong ma, mình go nya. Nhưng không có lu nâng xia linh tia có từ yên chúa. Có hai luôn tao thâu lợ. King Su cried as he reached behind him, pulled the arrow from his wound, and aimed it toward Cheng Tu, who didn't duck in time, and it pierced his left eye. The man howled and dropped to the ground, yelling as he dashed out the balcony and fell to the ground. His men at arms picked him up and retreated as the arrows continued chasing them. AiniSua yelled as Cheng Tu sat on the bed with a bloody bandage to his eye. He ignored her pestering, and he took another shot of wine from the bottle. His pain was excruciating, but her voice was more annoying. He turned to her and laughed. Yakamotsu Chaku. Ya got what thou ye got what on haya goose yes. She cried. Cheng threw the bottle of wine and she ducked where it crashed into tiny pieces before her. He stood up and pointed a finger at her. And then he stopped and laughed. Did she? Kuya tonja kheka hai tia. Tu ka yo chao chi aku. Nu tu keng su bao hai tia. Nu tu keng su bao hai tia. Tu wa to nu tu min ko nya. O nin chan do. Chi aku te tia. De shi ako. Nun da man che ka yo chi mo ki di liao. King Su watched as his bride slept in his bedchamber, and her soft breathing brought comfort to him. He had sent his men on a hunt for hours and couldn't find where Cheng Tu had disappeared to. But he knew who was behind this, and it was the one person who had been absent from their wedding. He heard a moan and looked up to find her eyes opening. He walked over and sat down beside her as she pushed herself to a sitting position. When she had steadied herself, her eyes fell onto something on his cloak. He followed her gaze and saw her staring at the moon design. Morachi, he asked. She frowned and then looked up at him. Lu Linaga. Niyarachi. He touched the design on the moon and then looked up at her. Lulina, yakunia pasa rupe hainen. Thao nang to pe ru to nong. Ku khơ tới họ cậu kia. Lòng mua đâu của pe sing to na. Oja. She shook her head and didn't answer. He smiled and then he asked, Oja có một bọc la. She didn't answer, and when she tried to move, he blocked her way. He forced her to look up at him. Oja có bỏ hậu gì sát tệ. Mai Sia looked up, shocked. Go ahead again. Smiling, he replied, Các chị tao ya hành tao à? Cậu yên bao. Giật gì cân nông đi nọ chế, cái yên bỏ lợn. Hay là, sao rồi cô? Cái ya cô bỏ cái ya cô sẽ lợn. Cho cô, she warned. Cô sẽ ya khai đó chứ khai à? Lo cái watch tole yarako. King Su laughed, and then suddenly he grabbed her by the throat. Ka sa tia, ka chỉ đó hu na ba. Lì rau có muốn đâu nè thà na, muốn nông hai tia xây ya lì cả tia. She fought his hand. Cho cú na, cú như chỉ cho. Rau nào của tao có là ô của tu là, cú yêu sai mu xây ka chỉ yêu rai nữa the king tế bộ tư na. Mai Sia began to cry as she thought back on what she'd found in her father's study. She took several deep breaths, trying to calm herself. King Su, tao có sao lì cả cô. He leaned down and smiled. Cô như chiều lì cả cô. Cái lúc ở trong khi tao xóa ya cho cô. Tears rolled down her cheeks and she began to shake. Hai lý có, sai tao hay tiệt, cái gì của sư bây giờ. Cái những bảo lò lên đấy hay tiệt, cô chỉ là lần tư. Thế này tao đã chỉ bây giờ. King Su smiled and brushed his lips against her cheek. Yeah, cô tự mình coi nha. Ý chỉ cô lúc học pia. Nhưng nhau là chân, cả tao ya có gì lúc sắp là ô cô tu. Rồi nó ya có gì lúc thế cô xí, nhớ được cô sát tệ là. Ya có gì lúc họ chơi chỉ là tí cô như chỉ bố nữa đi. Có bà xã báo để lần từ ya tuần trai của trẻ nâng tu nông. Ya có xã báo ya muốn nông tu nâng có hùa có gì. He slowly let his hand go from her neck, and Mai Sia coughed as she pushed herself away from him. She managed to stand up, and she turned around to face him. Rong cơ, khảo có khẽ cái tụi khen ra của bảo. Mà nói hữu trong trống. Khảo tia, yo chú mô kế lôn xì. Tụi xì mà nói của bảo tao hay tia. Cô cho kế lôn xì nhưng tùn thọ lợi. Cho cô đặc á. He stood up and walked to her. Cho con. Cho cô tụi mình câu nhá. Cơ cho kế xí hay tia có yo trò bỏ có nè cái gì lọ. Xin hú nọ mù. Có yo cô tụi. He grabbed her arm, pulling her close to him. Ya cũng chơi chấp lờ, ya thấu có gì từ mình xài đó tí lò lú cụ. Anh chia nữ chín đó kiến dụ. Thấu nó của Lucia yo cả chấp lờ. With tears dripping down her face, she sobbed. Có sao kia xế kia. He laughed and bent down to kiss her cheek. Cứ kia xế chấp lờ hó, cụ mi ta ra. She pushed him away. Nhờ lý, cứ chờ cô đã chị. Ôi trời có chị kia của tôi mộ. Smiling, he replied, "Cú chỉ kia cái tôi, ya cái tôi là yêu trong đó chỉ, cái tôi thì yêu suy đó của sao cái tôi." He didn't expect her to move past him that fast due to her injury, and before he could stop her, she picked up the small dagger on the fruit tray. She pointed it to her throat, and his heart dropped. Breathing deeply, she pricked her skin where a drop of blood began dripping down her slender neck. Ya có chỉ tôi cô. He moved across to where she was and took her arm away from her throat, and in one movement, she stabbed the dagger into his shoulder. The pain escalated across him as he grabbed her head and pulled her in for a kiss. She twisted the dagger, and he groaned, biting her lip. He tasted her blood on him as she pulled away, taking the dagger with her. She fell to the ground where she looked up at him with bloody lips. Her wound on her shoulder had tore, and she was now bleeding again. "Did you just look at the kingly?" he asked. She smiled and stood up with shaking shoulders. "But yeah, he walked to her and took the dagger from her hands. He turned, shouting for his servants to tend to her wounds. Thank you for tuning in to Janju Jai Plig Part 8. Part 9 will be out shortly.